I mean, there's a lot of overhead traffic.
Mm,
Uh, there's a noticeable change. And as
mm,
you know, we're a little bit fortunate being in Jerusalem.
right.
But
Yes.
so far, we're definitely, I guess, in an advantageous position right now. So
Okay. All right.
praise God.
Let's learn for our brethren.
Amen.
Okay. So we're going to start a new tshuva today. Oh, there you go. So here we go. Ah, here is a great issue having to do with copyright law, something that my dad was an expert in. I mean, that was what he did because he was in the music business. So I've given a number of shiurim on the whole issue of copyright, propriety, intellectual property is what I should say, and stealing intellectual property. Okay, so ha'atakat shir otzilum misefer shekatuv alav kol hazuchuyot shemurot. Copying a song or making copies from a book which say that all rights reserved. Okay, so ha'im mutar laha'atik diskim shel shira o litzalem keta misefer shekatuv bo kol hazuchuyot shmurot. Is it permitted to copy a disc, a music disc, or is it permitted to make copies from a book that has, or here he says a paragraph from a book, which would fall under fair use law. There is something called fair use law, but we'll put that aside for a minute where it says all rights reserved. So Kosav Hatur, so he gets into the issue as follows. The Torah writes that Adam should obtain matana lechavero. If a person gives a gift to his friend, if he wants it to be a complete gift, it has to be a gift such that it is in the complete domain of the recipient, in that he can do with it whatever he wishes. Aval im mifaresh natan lo b'matana al menat shelo yitain ota lemishu acher. But let's say I give you a gift and I say, this is yours on the condition that you don't give it to anybody else. O shelo limkor ota, or that you don't sell it. In other words, I've had that situation before where a gift was given. There was a fellow who had copies of his grandfather's sefer. And he said, I'm only giving this to people who commit that they're going to learn from it, right? That they're going to actually reference it. If you're not going to reference it, you're not entitled to getting it. So in other words, placing a condition on the gift where you limit a person's full ownership of it, hamatanahi lamashu piresh, then it turns out that the gift can be limited in that way. It is possible to limit a gift in certain ways halachically. The chol tenaisha b'mamon teno kayim. Any kind of condition that is placed upon a financial transaction can be binding. Kevin sheyesh biad adam lahashir la'atzmo zuchuyot, because a person does have a right to reserve rights, even of something that he relinquishes to somebody else. Ve'ein havdel bein matana lemecher, and there is no difference between a gift and a sale. Shegam b'mecher yochol limkor b'tanoi misuyamim, that even with a sale, you can reserve rights of the sale and basically say, I'm selling this to you on the condition that you use it in a certain way, that you use the item in a certain way, okay? So that's the first principle. This is brought by the Torah. Now, v'lachein, Adam shomocher sefer o kaletet im kol hazuchuyot chutz mizchut ha'ataka. Therefore, if a person sells a book or a recording with giving the purchaser all rights except for rights of copying, Osha Oser Litzalem Yimenu, or he says you may not copy, you may not let's say, reproduce it in photographic form. Zuchuto hamaleya la'asot tanai zeh ba'al dad zehu mocher. It is within the seller's purview to do this, and because he's only selling it on that condition. V'lachein im katuv shehu oser zuchut silum o ha'ataka, and therefore, if he writes, the author, right, or the seller reserves rights to prevent copying, asr l'shum adam l'tzalim o lahatik mimenu. It is forbidden for anyone to make copies of it. Va'afilu l'tzorech atzmo she'eno osa kein limkor la'acherim. And that's true, he says, that even if it's for his own use, where he's not doing it to sell to others, ki al das zehu mocher lo, because he's only selling it on that condition. Now, that is not consistent with fair use law. Fair use law is, let me just look it up real quickly, basically says that a seller does have a right okay, so just say, fair use is a doctrine in United States law that permits limited use of copyrighted material without having to first acquire permission from the copyright holder. Fair use is one of the limitations to copyright intended to balance the interests of copyright holders with the public interest in the wider distribution and use of creative works by allowing as a defense to copyright infringement claims certain limited uses that might otherwise be considered infringement. It's generally broader than the fair dealing rights known in most countries that inherited English common law. Okay, so it goes through the history and it goes through the factors. So it includes commentary, search engines, criticism, parody, news reporting, research, and scholarship. It allows for legal unlicensed citation or incorporation of copyrighted material in another author's work under a 4-factor test. Okay, so we're not going to get into the technical stuff right now. Do you know anything about Canadian fair use law?
Very similar.
Oh, yeah?
I had the same deal with lawyers using stuff in the court library, but to take it out of court and use it or take it home and stuff like that. And they all got changed a bit, but it's very similar.
Okay, so so the only issue is that, yes, in principle, you know, secular law agrees with this idea that you can withhold rights to the purchaser, right? To say that you can't, let's say, use this disc that we're selling you and then reproduce the disc and sell it to other people, which is what they do in China, right? Right. But let's say I buy a CD, which, you know, means that we're all old if we know what a CD is. I buy a CD.
It used to be cassette.
Actually, right.
I used to buy records.
Yeah, I know. LPs.
Put it onto a cassette so I could listen to it. Absolutely.
That's right. So fair use law would allow you to do that. It would allow you to reproduce it for personal use. Yeah, right?
You should pay the initial purchase.
Right. Fair use would allow you to include a citation or even to make a photocopy of an individual page of someone's book.
You have to make a note of where you got that information from. Like when I'm doing presentations, if I take something out of a magazine or a database, I have to put at the bottom.
Yeah. Usually, I mean, if it's for personal use, you don't have to. For personal use, not right. But if it's
Rabbi, what do you think about making copies for a shiur?
Right.
It's not personal use. We come in, you know, you have 10, 20 people in a room. You make copies of a sefer.
So if it's limited pages of a sefer, then it's okay. And also you have to find out whether the sefer is available for sale. But otherwise, you'd have to get permission from the author in order to be able to do that. Okay.
Also a statute of limitation. Years, if it's 100 years old or something like that, it becomes public domain.
Yeah, right. But that's
I think I'd take photocopies of the Rambam's book or something like that.
yeah, well,
Or is it the current publisher?
the current publisher does have a right to say that I'm limiting your use of my typesetting. and and annotations, and a lot of work went into this. So we'll get to that. There's a long list of literature that deals with copyright law in halacha, and it does have to do with svarim largely. So it's further mitigated by sharing of electronic material. In other words, first of all, we share 20 pages at a time of any sefer that we use, and we also don't print it. So it's not like it's practical for us to sell this material and to capitalize off of it. It's what we do when a person gives over a sefer to Otsar HaChachma, which is where I got this sefer from. It's with the understanding that people can learn from it and teach from it. And so that's the reason why we're justified in doing it. Okay. So anyway.
Maybe I should just wait for the stuff to come out, but if you're not the original, so tell me if it's coming up later, you're not the original owner, but like you borrow something from the library, so you didn't buy it ever, but you make a copy of stuff from it.
So there's a fair use law would say 1 or 2 pages is permissible, or even a chapter, but not more than that, because then you're depriving the author of that owner of the intellectual property of compensation for what he's entitled to that compensation.
Unless it's out of print, is that what we're saying?
If it's out of print, so then I think you still have to get permission from the author in order to be able to make a copy of the whole book. V'lachein Adam shemocher sefer o kaletet im kol hazuchuyot chutz mischut ha'ataka o shosa l'tzalim imenu. And therefore, if a person sells a sefer or a recording with giving the purchaser all rights except for rights of copying, zuchuto hamalea laso tenaizev al datzehu mocher. He has full rights to do that. V'lachein im kasuf shehu oser zuchut silamo ha'ataka. And therefore, okay, so we just read this paragraph. So Rav Sharaga doesn't include the fair use law in his discussion yet, but let's see. Because of the Sefer Tevuo Shor Bahakdamaso, that the Sefer Tevuo Shor, which I think it's 19th century, but I have to go back and look. Dilemifur Samot Ein Sarich Raya, Diyachol Kol Adam Le'esor Et Shalo. He says it is a well-known fact that a person can prohibit that which belongs to him, meaning his intellectual property. And for that reason, he says, I hereby forbid anyone else from copying my sefer and to reprint it. Like even if a person were to, let's say, take the sefer to Tevuo Shor and say, I'm going to retypeset it, it is within the purview of the author to say, this is my intellectual property, and I hereby forbid anyone from doing that. Va'od kasav sham harav rosh hamizbeach demilo yoda bepeh mole asher lo koach v'hamishra le'esor et shelo l'chol echad. And I don't know, I'm not familiar with this author, the Rosh HaMizbeach, but he says that it is quite clear who will deny this, that any author has the right to prohibit others from taking his property. Uveshut Yabia Omer, Kasav Shepashad Haminag Lesser Hein Medina de Malchusa, Vehein al Pi Gezeras Vahaskamas Hamachabrim Vaharabanim Hamaskimim Lechibor. Rav Ovadia says similarly that it is already common practice based both on Dina de Malchusa, the law of the land, and also based on the decrees and the consensus of the great Rabbanim who give credence to intellectual property. Okay. Now, he quotes, the Makor Baruch just quotes this from the Sefer Tevuo Shir from the Minchas Yitzchak, Rav Weiss. He says, Kvar Ra'isi b'Sefer Tevuo Shor Hanitvas b'Lemberg Shnas Tov Reish Nun Aleph. I noticed in the Sefer Tevuo Shor that was published in Lemberg in Europe in Tov Reish Nun Aleph, that's like 130 years ago. Modo'a Rabba le'oraisa me'es hagon moreno harav Feivel Halevi Okay, Asher Kosov B'zeh HaLashon, who wrote the following in his introduction. Samot ein tzarech raya ki yachol kol adam le'asor es shelo. He says it goes without saying. In other words, something that is so well known doesn't need to be well documented as far as its source, but that every author has the right to prohibit or reserve rights on how his intellectual property is going to be used. Umehai taima oser et hatfasat sifro v'gam et hasefer daled ayin kuf. I don't know what that refers to. Asher yiga harbe lisidro mikisve kodesh neyarot la'alafim asher hishir acharav hagon hakodesh av based in Buchach. So this other sefer, another sefer that he says also was great effort was expended in order to publish it, thousands of pages. Machalesham kol gedolei doro le'esor iser al haboim lifroz geder v'laharos gavul asher gavlu rishonim. And he also includes in there a consensus of all of the gedolei hador of his time that who prohibit similarly. Labal yorum eza madfis et yado lahadfis sefer mebeli rishus mechavera. That any person who has a printing press is prohibited from taking a sefer from another publisher and just retypesetting it, omatiko bodenu chai, or to republish a sefer while the author is still alive. Asher ad koto eva kazos lo nihiyes, that to date such an abomination never took place. Velo nir asa be Israel, and it has never occurred among Israel. The lesor bein al hamochrim and bein al hakonim ayin sham, and therefore it is prohibited both for the sellers and the buyers to peddle a book that has been illegally copied from another publisher. V'nitfasu sham kamo asara migdolei hamorim asher nasnu mehodom lahaskim himagon bahamoda'a hanal, and there are about 10 gedolim of the time who lend their signature to this. V'sham b'divrei hagon ba'al mechaber sefer Rosh HaMizbeach mavur b'zeh halashon. And the mechaber of a sefer called Rosh HaMizbeach, which I guess is not as popular today as it was back then, umize lo yoda b'pemole asher lo hakoch v'hamishra lesor shelo al kol echad ve'ein laharav bal hamoda levakesh ezer me'echad meharabanim ad kam l'shana. He said it is so obvious that every publisher has the right, and every author has the right to reserve rights on his own intellectual property, and there's not even a need for the publisher to even seek the assistance of any of these rabbanim who are signing on, because it is so obvious. Verubam heviu kamarayas l'divrayim ayin sham, and most of the gedolim who signed on also added their own arguments of support. Okay, let us go on. So now he says, V'yesh ladun ba'ofen sherotzim l'tzalim rak amud mispar oketa echad, or rak amud misefer, right? So the question is, now he gets into fair use. What if I only want to photocopy one page or one paragraph? Ha'imza bichlal ha'isr, does that include it? B'shut shevet halevi nishal b'veit sefer shemalamdim yahadus shemalamdim mikama svarim. So there was a school that the Shevet Halevi was asked the question. He says, in this school, they're teaching Judaism 101. And they provide excerpts from a number of different svarim. You know, if you're teaching Judaism 101, you're going to want to quote from some Chumash, from some Gemara, from some Midrash, from some Rambam, right? The Ramban, Rashi, right? Ve'ein l'chol habanot et kol hasfarim. So the girls can't, purchase a whole library of this stuff. Umitzalmim ma'amar echad misefer ploni u'ma'amar acher misefer acher. So they're constantly photocopying excerpts from different svarim. Iblo havi. He says, are we in fact infringing on someone else's copyright and is it necessary for us to buy all of these books for all the girls? The He'elala Hatir, so Diane Weiss said it's okay. Kevin Shehei Matfisim Litzorech, is this the Diane Weiss or is it Rav Vosner? Sorry, this is Rav Vosner. He said it's okay. Kevin Shehei Matfisim Litzorech Atzmam. He says it's okay because they're making copies for personal use. In other words, they're not making copies for resale. They're making copies for personal use so they can use it to teach from. And even though through doing this, the original publisher is losing out on the opportunity to sell books, because the students are not going to be required now to buy the books. This is merely depriving someone of the opportunity to profit and is not stealing or is not going into invading someone else's business. And this is especially true because they're only copying select pages. And also under the proviso that they cannot proliferate this beyond the walls of the school. In other words, it's for the use of the school internally, and therefore Rav Vosner feels that it's justifiable. And based on what we wrote above, that every person has the right to reserved rights and to prohibit how his intellectual property will be used, and anyone who sells on with such conditions, those conditions are binding. It's logical to conclude that the author or the creator of the property doesn't mind for snippets, for selections of his intellectual property to be extracted. But he says, but to make a full copy of a song from a disc, right, from a recording, and then to make a copy of it, he says, it seems that composers do not want that to take place. And this would therefore be no different from a person who copies an entire chapter, let's say, from a book where the author says, no, I don't give permission for this. In other words, fair use also is subject to, let's say, you have to think about reasonable use. In other words, would the owner of this intellectual property say, no, you're taking too much and you need to pay for it? Or would he say, okay, such a small amount is acceptable? Today, even taking one song would be considered to be an infringement on intellectual property because people purchase individual songs off of iTunes and other
cases where if you've taken part of the tune.
That's called sampling. Yeah, right. So that's also a question of whether, but that goes to a higher level because that's not for personal use anymore. That's for you're capitalizing it and creating your own property for sale using someone else's intellectual property. So it's a very complicated set of laws. What is considered to be fair use sampling and what is not considered to be fair use sampling, right? And the rap industry got itself into a lot of trouble about 20 years ago because they were sampling stuff from other older songs without paying the original artists for those samples. Yeah. Okay. V'chein kasav, b'shut tzitz Eliezer, lahatir litzalei ma'amorim misefer l'shimush atzmi. The tzitz Eliezer also permits photocopying from books for personal use. Lamrot shebishar hasefer mofi azara she'en lahatik l'shem shimush atzmi. Even though the introduction to the book says you can't even make copies for personal use. Kevin shahamotzi laor yodea mizeh, im ken yesh kan yeyush umevater merosh al ha'ataka v'tzilum. And the reason is because since the author understands that people are going to be making copies, it's something that he knows that he cannot control, and therefore he's mevater, therefore he forgives. In other words, it's considered to be fair use. Uvehemshech devarav sham dan d'shayich lomer bazeh kofen al midas sedom. And Rav Waldenberg goes so far as to say that it's almost like a midas sedom if a person were to withhold even copying of small snippets. What is midas sedom? Midas sedom is zen nehene v'zelo chaser. I'm benefiting, you're not losing anything. In other words, I purchased the book, you already got paid. I want to copy a snippet from it to be able to share with others. That's already, you're being too greedy if you expect that even if I quote a paragraph or I photocopy a paragraph from your book, that's considered to be a violation of copyright. V'chein das hagrashaz orbach zatzal shemutar laha'atik o letzalei misefer mashu hutzarach l'shem limud v'shimush ishi kol sheino osa l'shem mischar. Rav Shlomo Zalman also said that it is permissible to make copies from a sefer of whatever you need for personal use, as long as you're not reselling what you're copying. In other words, so for example, let's say a person were to want to make a compilation book of, let's say, different ideas from different Sfarim, and then he's going to slap on his own cover and he's going to try to sell it. That would be an infringement on copyright, because even though you may only be taking a small amount from that book, but by you trying to gain income through someone else's intellectual property, the standards are higher. In other words, there's a greater restriction placed upon you. So we've seen two factors so far. Number one is fair use, meaning it's a small section, a small excerpt. And number two, it's for personal use, not for resale. So you really need both of those factors in order for it to be permitted. To take even a small excerpt for resale would also be problematic, okay? Now, what I have, I've told this to, let's say this becomes an issue also when we do keynotes on Tisha B'Av. And the person who runs the morning keynotes on Tisha B'Av makes these extensive photocopies from the Koren Keynotes book. And I've told them you need to seek permission from the publisher to give you the right to do that. I believe he did, because it happened, it's already many years, but I should really revisit it and make sure that I've made sure he's done it properly. So anyway.
So no one's selling this, they're just using it for that day and giving it back.
But we don't know that he's giving it back. So we don't know that he's giving it back. Maybe the person's there's nothing on those booklets that says you cannot keep this.
You say at the beginning, he's putting it back in the box when we're done.
Perhaps.
But we haven't really discussed yet the loss of income for the original author. And that has to come into some of the discussion about copyright. Like what you're trying to do is to protect your income to some extent. The intellectual property is for sure there, but also you published a book in the desire that it's going to generate some income for you.
Right.
So where does the copyright? Where do we talk about the copyright protecting that income? Let's say you photocopy a chapter. Why not get the people to buy the book and then they can have the chapter and the whole thing that goes with it? I mean,
right.
Where does that come into this?
Well, it does. It does come into it. Copying a full chapter of a book does not fall under fair use. because specifically for that reason is that the author is entitled to be compensated for his intellectual property.
So if you need more than a paragraph, so.
Well, a page or two is usually what's called fair use, even maybe 3 or 4 pages. But if it's an entire chapter, that becomes no longer reasonable. Okay, so Af shebishar hasefer yesh ashara me'amachaber me'amotzi la'or sha'asr lasos kain. And Reb Shlomo Zalman says that fair use can be extended even if no extension is offered in the opening pages. In other words, even if it says at the opening of the sefer, all reproduction is prohibited, all reproduction and excerpts are prohibited, nonetheless, there's an assumption that fair use is still legally binding. Ulam shona hadog. Oh, so we'll have to hold it here because we're already out of time. Let's pick this up in Mirz Hashem tomorrow.